The hospital was quiet that night, the usual hum of machinery and soft whispers of the night shift staff blending into a gentle lullaby. Nurse Emily had just finished her rounds and was headed back to her station when a weak voice caught her attention. Turning, she saw Ruth, an elderly woman who'd been a regular on the ward for as long as anyone could remember. Ruth was fragile, almost lost beneath the sterile hospital sheets, but her eyes held a surprising intensity. She waved Emily over with a trembling hand, and Emily, feeling a strange urgency, moved quickly to her side. As she bent close, Ruth whispered with a voice as thin as air, "Don't tell my son I'm alive." The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. She pulled back slightly, searching Ruth's face for some explanation, but Ruth's gaze was steady, holding Emily's with a quiet desperation that made it impossible to look away. Emily opened her mouth to ask a question, to press for more, but Ruth reached out and clutched her hand with surprising strength, silencing her. "Promise me," Ruth insisted, her fingers tightening around Emily's. The nurse felt a surge of sympathy and confusion mix within her. She had always been known for her compassion. She was the kind of nurse who would listen to an elderly patient's story about their grandchildren, even when her shift was running long. And Ruth had shared her stories over the months, snippets of a life that Emily had pieced together, a quiet life, marked by regrets, but one with moments of beauty and love. Yet in all those stories, Ruth had barely mentioned her family, and Emily realized now how little she truly knew. I promise," Emily whispered, feeling the weight of those words settle over her. Ruth's grip relaxed, and her eyes softened, though the intensity of her request lingered. She seemed relieved, even at peace, but Emily's mind was already racing. She knew promises made on a hospital bed held an urgency and finality that few people could understand. Nurses often became the keepers of secrets, the last witnesses to the unspoken truths of lives about to fade. But this felt different. There was something heavy, something unresolved that Ruth seemed to be carrying alone. Emily finished her shift, but Ruth's words echoed in her mind long after she clocked out and drove home. The request gnawed at her, pricking her conscience. Why wouldn't Ruth want her son to know she was still alive? What had happened between them that led to such a final, heart-wrenching request? She spent a sleepless night replaying the conversation in her mind, questioning whether she should keep a promise she didn't fully understand. The next morning, when Emily returned to work, she couldn't resist the urge to seek out more about Ruth's life. She knew Ruth's son lived somewhere nearby. An old address in town had been listed on Ruth's paperwork when she was first admitted. Emily also knew that, unlike most families, Ruth's son never visited, never called. It was rare, and while Emily hadn't given it much thought before, now it felt like a crucial piece of the puzzle. During her lunch break, she stopped by the records room, telling herself she was only checking for a legitimate reason, to ensure Ruth's emergency contact information was up to date, in case of a sudden turn in her health. But as Emily sifted through Ruth's file, she found something unexpected. An old, crumpled photo tucked between the pages. The photo was faded, creased at the edges, showing a young woman with a radiant smile and a small child on her hip. A little boy with the same eyes as Ruth. Emily's heart tightened at the sight. She recognized the woman as a younger version of Ruth, but something about the boy struck her deeply. There was a warmth in his gaze, a simple happiness that told of an unbreakable bond. What had happened to change that? She wondered what could drive a mother and son so far apart, to the point where a mother would choose to let her son believe she was dead rather than reconnect. The question lingered, coloring her interactions with Ruth over the next few days. Emily couldn't bring herself to ask outright, but as Ruth's health began to decline, she gently encouraged Ruth to share pieces of her life. And Ruth, perhaps sensing the end was drawing near, finally opened up. It was slow, tentative, and fractured, like a story told in whispers and shadows. Ruth spoke of a son named Daniel, a bright, inquisitive boy who'd once adored her. She told Emily about her early years, raising Daniel alone after her husband had left. struggling but determined. She'd done her best, and for a while, they'd been happy. But as Daniel grew older, he began to ask questions she couldn't answer, to seek a life beyond the quiet one she tried to give him. There had been a fight, a misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. Daniel had left home in a rage, vowing never to return, and Ruth, heartbroken and stubborn, had let him go. Years passed, and the silence between them hardened into something unbreakable. She'd watched from afar as he built a life of his own, convincing herself he was better off without her. Now, as she lay in a hospital bed, her life slipping through her fingers, Ruth's only wish was to let him live without the burden of knowing she was still alive. Emily listened, heart heavy, feeling the weight of Ruth's pain as if it were her own. She wanted to comfort Ruth, to tell her it wasn't too late, that people could change, that families could heal. But Ruth's gaze was resolute, filled with the weary acceptance of someone who'd carried this burden for too long. "Please, Emily," Ruth said, voice wavering. "Let him live without me. He deserves that chance." Emily nodded, swallowing the words that fought to escape. She had promised, after all. But as she left Ruth's bedside that evening, a deep unease settled over her. She knew the boundaries of her job as a nurse, yet there was something about Ruth's story that wouldn't let her rest. She couldn't help but feel that Ruth's final wish was a mistake, a wish born from pain rather than peace. And as she walked out into the darkening evening, Emily made a decision, though she wasn't sure she could follow through. The following days passed in a haze of routine, but Emily's mind was far from her daily tasks. She moved through her rounds with the practiced efficiency that came from years of nursing, yet her thoughts lingered on Ruth's story. It gnawed at her, like a puzzle missing its final piece. The photograph of Ruth and young Daniel had stayed with her, the image of their bond haunting her, reminding her of all the lost years and unspoken words between mother and son. Ruth's request weighed heavily on her heart, a burden that felt more like a test than a promise. One evening, as she was tidying up Ruth's room, Emily decided to broach the subject again. Despite Ruth's initial insistence, she took a seat beside her bed and waited, sensing that Ruth, now weaker, had been waiting too. Perhaps not for her son, but for someone to listen without judgment, someone who could understand without knowing her past. The silence stretched between them, filling with unspoken memories. "I found a photo," Emily began gently, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruth's eyes flickered, showing a hint of recognition before hardening into something guarded. "Did you?" Ruth replied softly, her gaze drifting away, as if unwilling to confront the memories captured in that piece of paper. "You and your son," Emily continued, watching Ruth's reaction closely. "You looked happy." Ruth let out a shaky sigh, a mixture of sorrow and nostalgia in her expression. For a long moment, she said nothing, only stared into the distance, lost in the haze of old memories. Emily waited, feeling that whatever Ruth chose to share would not come easily. Finally, Ruth began to speak, her words slow and tinged with regret. "We were happy once," she murmured, her eyes distant. "Back then, it was just the two of us against the world. I thought I was doing right by him, giving him everything I could. But there was always something missing. A truth I kept hidden, believing it was for his own good." Emily listened, holding her breath, knowing that Ruth was finally beginning to reveal the root of her pain. Ruth continued, her voice trembling. "I never told him the truth about his father. He thought his father abandoned us, and I let him believe that. I thought it would protect him, but I was wrong. Daniel grew up with anger in his heart, and by the time he was old enough to understand, it was too late. He was already lost to me." Ruth's voice broke, and she turned her face away, her body shuddering with the weight of her confession. Emily felt a surge of empathy, realizing the complexity of Ruth's story. It wasn't just a tale of estrangement. It was one of miscommunication, of wounds that had festered over time. She placed a comforting hand on Ruth's arm, offering silent support. Ruth took a deep, shuddering breath before continuing. He left home when he was 17, Ruth went on, her voice barely audible. He was angry, rebellious. I tried to reach out to him, but every attempt only seemed to push him further away. And then he disappeared. I heard rumors, saw glimpses of him in the news once or twice, but he never came back. The years went by, and I convinced myself that he was better off without me. Maybe he built a life, found peace somewhere. And now it's too late. The sadness in her voice was palpable, a sorrow so deep that it seemed to drain the room of air. Emily could see the regret etched into Ruth's lined face, the lifetime of pain she had carried. But Emily also sensed something else, an unspoken desire for reconciliation, a longing that Ruth had buried beneath years of self-imposed guilt. That evening, as Emily left the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ruth's story was far from over. Ruth might believe it was too late, but Emily couldn't accept that. She found herself thinking about Daniel, wondering what had become of him. Had he truly moved on? Was he living a life blissfully unaware of his mother's struggles, or was he out there, carrying his own burden of regret? Emily felt a surge of determination. She knew it wasn't her place to interfere, but she also knew that some family bonds were too strong to ignore. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and compassion, Emily decided to dig deeper. She knew that if she could locate Daniel, perhaps she could offer him the choice his mother had never given him, a chance to reconcile, to hear her side of the story, even if it was only for closure. It was a risky move, one that could jeopardize her career if her intentions were misunderstood. But Emily couldn't ignore the pull of her heart, the belief that sometimes nurses were meant to heal more than just bodies. Over the next few days, Emily discreetly asked around, relying on her network of contacts and friends in town. It wasn't easy. Daniel had left without a trace, and tracking him down felt like chasing shadows. But then, on a rainy afternoon, Emily's friend Sarah, a retired social worker, reached out with a surprising lead. "Emily," Sarah said, her voice tinged with curiosity, "I heard you were looking for someone. An estranged son, was it?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, his name's Daniel. Ruth's son. Do you know him?" "I think I might," Sarah replied slowly. "There's a man in town who fits his description. A reclusive artist. I don't know much about him, but he goes by Daniel. Lives in a small cabin on the outskirts. Doesn't socialize much, keeps to himself. It could be him, or just a coincidence." Emily felt a surge of hope and fear in equal measure. Could it really be him? The idea seemed almost too good to be true, yet her instincts told her to pursue it. That evening, she drove out to the edge of town, feeling the weight of her promise to Ruth yet unable to turn back. She parked her car outside a modest cabin, its windows darkened, surrounded by overgrown weeds and a few scattered pieces of driftwood. It looked more like a hideaway than a home, a place to disappear rather than to live. She approached the cabin, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath her. A sense of apprehension filled her, but she pushed forward, knowing she had come too far to turn back now. She raised her hand, hesitating before knocking softly on the door. A few moments passed, and Emily began to wonder if anyone was home. But then she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from inside, and the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a man who could only be Daniel, older, wearier, but unmistakably Ruth's son. He looked at her with a guarded expression, a hint of surprise flickering in his eyes as he took in the sight of a stranger on his doorstep. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough, like someone unaccustomed to speaking with others. Emily hesitated, searching for the right words. "Are you Daniel?" she asked softly. The man's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, Emily feared she had overstepped, that she had ventured too far into a world she didn't belong. But then Daniel gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I'm Daniel," he replied cautiously. "Who are you?" Taking a deep breath, Emily introduced herself and explained her connection to Ruth, choosing her words carefully. She didn't tell him everything. Not yet, but she spoke enough to convey her concern, to hint at the burden Ruth had been carrying. Daniel listened, his face a mask of indifference, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion when she mentioned his mother's name. When Emily finished, Daniel was silent for a long time. He looked away, staring into the shadows of his cabin, as if wrestling with memories he tried to forget. "I thought she'd forgotten about me," he murmured, more to himself than to Emily. "After all these years, I thought. Maybe she moved on." Emily felt her heart ache for both of them, two people locked in a silent war of pride and pain, each believing the other had given up. She wanted to reach out, to tell him the truth, but she knew that would be crossing a line. Instead, she simply placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, offering a quiet reassurance. "She hasn't forgotten," Emily said softly. "She never has." Daniel's gaze met hers, and in that moment, Emily knew he was at a crossroads. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily could feel the weight of the silence between them, thick and charged with unspoken words. Daniel stood there, rooted in place, wrestling with an avalanche of emotions she could barely imagine. The years of separation and unresolved pain had hardened him, yet she sensed a deep vulnerability just beneath the surface. He stared at her, questions flickering across his face, and for a fleeting moment, Emily thought he might close the door, shutting her out and retreating back into his solitude. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back and gestured for her to come inside, his eyes wary yet curious. Emily entered, noting the sparse furnishings and the distinct smell of paint and wood. It was a place crafted by someone used to being alone, filled with remnants of a life lived on the margins. Canvases leaned against the walls, splashes of color and shadow that revealed more about him than words ever could. She could see the turmoil in his work, broad, sweeping strokes that hinted at storms of anger and sadness, yet some canvases were soft, even hopeful, as if he'd been searching for peace but hadn't quite found it. Emily waited, giving him space to gather his thoughts, not wanting to push him too quickly. She knew he was piecing things together, that her presence had stirred something within him he hadn't prepared to face. Finally, he spoke, his voice tinged with a bitterness that felt like armor. "So, she's still alive?" he asked, his tone flat but laced with an underlying hurt. Emily nodded, choosing her words carefully. "She is. She's in the hospital, and her health is fragile. She's made a life for herself here, but I think a big part of her has always been waiting for something, or maybe someone." Daniel let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Waiting? For what? I've been here for years, living just a few miles away, and she never reached out. Not once." His voice cracked slightly, betraying a pain he could no longer conceal. Emily felt a pang of empathy, sensing that the misunderstandings and unspoken regrets between them had grown into towering walls. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "She's complicated, Daniel. I don't know the full story, but I do know that she cares deeply for you. She told me about the past, about her regrets. She carries a lot of guilt. And I think, in her own way, she believed leaving you alone was what you needed." Daniel's face hardened, but there was a flicker of doubt, of longing, in his eyes. "She always thought she knew what was best for me," he muttered. "Even if it meant pushing me away. Maybe she was right. I don't even know her anymore, and she doesn't know me." Emily hesitated, her heart aching for both of them. "Maybe you're right," she conceded, her voice gentle. "But do you really want it to end like this? She's still here, Daniel. She's still waiting, whether she admits it or not. You both have a chance to talk, to say the things that were left unsaid. I can't promise it'll be easy, or that it'll bring you peace, but I do believe it's better than living with the weight of what-ifs." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he would argue, that he would dig his heels into his bitterness and refuse. But then his gaze softened, his shoulders sagging with the weight of years of anger and disappointment. What if she doesn't want to see me?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Emily offered him a sad smile. She made me promise not to tell you she was alive. I think that was her way of protecting herself from being hurt again. But people change, Daniel. She may have lost hope, but that doesn't mean she wouldn't welcome it if you brought it back to her. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair, his face etched with indecision. Emily could see the internal battle he was waging, the tug-of-war between pride and longing, between anger and forgiveness. She reached into her bag and pulled out the photo she'd found in Ruth's file, the one of him as a child, looking at his mother with nothing but love and trust. She handed it to him, and he stared at it, his expression softening as he traced the image of his younger self. I don't know what to say to her, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. How do you even start a conversation like this after so many years? Emily placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Sometimes you don't need to say anything. Just being there is enough. The words will come when you're ready, and I think she'll understand that. He nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the photo. I'll go, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But if she doesn't want to see me, if she doesn't, I'll leave her alone, and that'll be it. No more searching, no more wondering. Emily felt a wave of relief mixed with apprehension. She knew this meeting could either heal their wounds or deepen them, but she also knew that the chance was worth the risk. She left Daniel's cabin that night with a sense of hope, her heart heavy yet hopeful for the reunion that lay ahead. The next morning, Emily returned to the hospital, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her. Ruth was asleep when she arrived, her frail form almost swallowed by the crisp white sheets. Emily took a seat beside her bed, waiting until Ruth stirred awake, her eyes blinking open to find Emily watching her. Emily, Ruth murmured, her voice hoarse. You're here early. Emily smiled gently. I wanted to talk to you about something important. Ruth's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the gravity in Emily's tone. What is it, dear? Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. I spoke to Daniel. The silence that followed was thick and electric. Ruth's face drained of color, her frail hand clutching the edge of the sheet, her eyes widening in shock. You did what? She whispered, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. Emily nodded, her gaze unwavering. I found him, Ruth. He's been here, in this town, all along, and he wants to see you. Ruth's reaction was immediate. She shook her head vigorously, her breathing growing labored. No. I told you, Emily. I told you not to tell him. He doesn't need to see me like this. He's better off not knowing. Emily reached out, taking Ruth's trembling hand in hers. Ruth, he's not better off. He's been carrying his own pain all these years, just like you. And he deserves the chance to say what he needs to say. You both do. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, her face contorted with anguish. What if he hates me, Emily? What if he can't forgive me? Emily gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Maybe he's angry, Ruth. Maybe he's hurt, but he's here, and he's willing to talk. That means something. It means there's still hope. Ruth looked away, her body shaking with silent sobs. Emily sat beside her, waiting, letting her process the emotions that had long been buried. Finally, Ruth looked back at her, a glimmer of resolve in her tear-filled eyes. All right, she whispered. I'll see him. Just give me a moment to prepare myself. Emily nodded, feeling a rush of relief. She left the room to find Daniel, who had been waiting nervously in the corridor. When he saw her, he straightened, his face a mixture of apprehension and determination. Without a word, Emily led him to Ruth's room, her heart pounding as she opened the door and gestured for him to enter. Ruth was sitting up in bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She looked up as Daniel stepped inside, and for a long, breathless moment, they simply stared at each other. Years of pain and silence hung in the air, a palpable barrier neither knew how to cross. But then Daniel took a step forward, his voice breaking the silence. Mom. That single word seemed to shatter the walls around them. Ruth's face crumpled, and she held out her hand, her voice a choked whisper. "Daniel." He moved to her side, taking her hand in his expression a mixture of anger, love, and sadness. Emily watched from the doorway, her heart swelling as she witnessed the tentative steps toward healing, the beginning of a journey they had both feared to take. She quietly closed the door, leaving mother and son to the privacy of their reunion, knowing that some wounds might never fully heal, but that the courage to face them was a victory in itself. Outside Ruth's hospital room, Emily lingered in the corridor, heart pounding with anticipation. She knew that the conversation unfolding behind a closed door was long overdue, yet she also understood that the path to healing was never straightforward. She hoped that, at the very least, Ruth and Daniel could find some measure of peace after so many years of silence and pain. Emily leaned against the wall, closing her eyes, trying to quiet the whirlwind of emotions within her. She felt a strange mix of relief, apprehension, and a deep, unshakable hope that this reunion might finally grant them both the release they had needed for so long. Inside the room, Ruth sat frozen, her hand still trembling in Daniel's. She had imagined this moment so many times, each scenario filled with dread and regret. But the reality was so much more intense than she'd ever prepared for. Daniel's face held traces of the boy she had loved and lost, but his eyes carried the weight of a man shaped by absence and unanswered questions. She could see the hurt, the resentment, and the guarded hope lurking there, barely hidden behind his attempt at composure. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel broke the silence, his voice low and tense. "Why, Mom? Why did you let me believe you were gone? Why did you disappear from my life like that?" The words trembled in the air, heavy with years of unspoken pain. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, her hand clinging to his as if he were her only anchor. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled in her throat, years of guilt choking her as she struggled to find a way to explain the choices she had made. I thought it was best for you," she whispered, her voice quivering. "I thought maybe you'd be happier without me in your life, that you could build something better without the baggage I carried." Daniel's brow furrowed, the confusion and hurt evident in his gaze. "You thought I'd be happier without knowing my own mother. Do you have any idea what that did to me, wondering if you were out there, or if you even cared?" Ruth's tears began to fall freely, her shoulders shaking with the weight of his accusations. "I didn't know how to reach out to you after we argued. I was so ashamed, so convinced that I had failed you as a mother. I was afraid that I'd only bring you more pain." She paused, taking a shuddering breath. "I convinced myself that leaving you alone was an act of love, that by staying away I could protect you from everything I thought I was." Daniel's expression softened, but the hurt remained, etched deeply into his features. He shook his head, struggling to understand. "All I ever wanted was for you to be there, Mom. I didn't need protection. I needed a mother. I needed someone who wouldn't give up on me, no matter how bad things got." Ruth lowered her gaze, her face lined with the remorse of 1,000 mistakes. "I know, Daniel," she murmured, her voice thick with regret. "I know that now. But back then, I was too blinded by my own fears. I thought I was protecting you from a broken person, someone who could never be the mother you deserved." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I know words can't fix what I did, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day." Daniel's hand tightened around hers, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. He looked away, wrestling with the mixture of emotions that churned inside him. Emily's words from the previous night echoed in his mind, reminding him that this was his chance to find closure, to say the things he'd kept buried for so long. Taking a deep breath, he let the years of bitterness slip from his grasp, allowing himself, for the first time, to confront the wounds that had shaped his life. "Mom, I spent years hating you for leaving, convincing myself that I didn't need you. I told myself that I could be strong without you, that I was better off on my own. he admitted, his voice trembling. But every time I hit a rough patch, every time I felt lost, I wished you were there. I wanted so badly to understand why you left, why you never came back. Ruth's heart ached at his words, her hand reaching up to touch his face, as if she could somehow erase the years of pain with a single gesture. I thought I was doing what was best, she whispered, her voice breaking. But I see now that I was only running away, too afraid to face my own mistakes. I failed you, Daniel. I failed you in ways I can never make right. A tear slipped down Daniel's cheek as he met her gaze, his face softening with an emotion that neither of them had allowed themselves to feel in years. Forgiveness. Slowly, he leaned in, wrapping his arms around her in a hesitant embrace, both of them clinging to each other as if afraid the moment would shatter. In that embrace, they let go of the years of anger, of bitterness, allowing themselves to feel the love that had always lingered beneath the surface, buried but unbroken. For a long while, they held each other in silence, allowing the weight of their reunion to settle. But as the initial wave of emotion faded, a new sense of urgency filled the room. Ruth knew she was running out of time, that whatever moments she had left with Daniel were precious, fleeting. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him with an intensity that caught him off guard. "There's something I need to tell you, Daniel," she said, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. "Something I've kept hidden for years, something that I never had the courage to face." Daniel looked at her, his curiosity piqued by the gravity in her tone. "What is it, Mom?" Ruth hesitated, her hands trembling as she took a deep breath. "It's about your father. I never told you the truth about him, and it's something I've carried with me all these years. I thought it was better if you never knew, but now, I can't keep it from you anymore." Daniel's eyes widened in shock, his mind racing as he tried to process her words. "My father?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. You told me he left us, that he abandoned us." Ruth nodded, her face filled with remorse. "That's what I wanted you to believe. I thought it would be easier for you to hate him than to know the truth. But the truth is, he didn't abandon us, Daniel. He loved you more than anything in the world. He was taken from us." A tense silence filled the room as Ruth's confession sank in. Daniel's mind reeled, his emotions a whirlwind of confusion, betrayal, and a strange sense of relief. For years, he had hated a man he believed had left them. But now, knowing that his father hadn't willingly abandoned him, a part of him felt a strange sense of peace, even as new questions began to surface. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice filled with both accusation and sadness. "Why did you let me believe he just walked away?" Ruth's gaze dropped, her hands twisting together as she searched for the right words. "I was afraid, Daniel. Afraid that knowing the truth would only hurt you more. I thought that by hiding it, I could protect you, that I could keep you safe from the pain of losing him." She looked up, her eyes filled with regret. "But I was wrong. I see that now." Daniel took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile the truth with the years of anger and resentment he had harbored. It would take time to process, to understand what it all meant, but he knew that this revelation had lifted a weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. After a long silence, he reached for her hand, his gaze softening. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly. "It doesn't erase the past, but it helps." Ruth gave him a small, sad smile, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I'm glad, Daniel. I only wish I'd had the courage to tell you sooner." They sat in silence, their hearts finally at peace, each finding comfort in the other's presence. For the first time in years, they felt the weight of their past lifting, replaced by a tentative hope for whatever time they had left. Outside the room, Emily stood by the door, her heart filled with relief and satisfaction. She knew that this reunion had changed them both, that the years of pain and regret had finally given way to a fragile but genuine healing. She had done what she could to bring them together, and now she could step back, knowing that Ruth and Daniel would find their own way forward. As she walked down the corridor, a sense of fulfillment washed over her. She had made a difference, not only in Ruth and Daniel's lives, but in her own. The experience had reminded her of the power of forgiveness, of the importance of family, and of the courage it took to face the past. In her heart, Emily knew that this was only the beginning of Ruth and Daniel's journey, that the scars of their separation would take time to heal. But for now, they had each other, and that was more than either of them had ever dared to hope for. In the days that followed their emotional reunion, Daniel visited Ruth every day, and each visit brought with it new conversations, shared memories, and deeper healing. For the first time in years, they began to rebuild the fragile threads of trust and understanding, piecing together the family they'd both believed lost forever. Ruth, though physically weaker with each passing day, seemed to find renewed strength in Daniel's presence. Her eyes lit up when he walked into the room, and her laughter, soft and rare as it was, filled the hospital ward with a warmth that had been missing for too long. Emily watched from a distance, feeling both relief and pride. She had witnessed the transformative power of reconnection, the way two broken souls could find their way back to each other even after years of silence and pain. But as Ruth's health continued to decline, a new fear gnawed at her, a fear that Ruth's time was running out faster than they all anticipated. One afternoon, as Emily was checking Ruth's vitals, Ruth reached out and touched her hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her frail state. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I want to make sure Daniel is taken care of after I'm gone." Emily felt a pang of sadness at Ruth's words, though she tried to hide it. She nodded, encouraging Ruth to continue. "Of course, Ruth. I'm sure he'll have all the support he needs." Ruth shook her head, her eyes intense as she looked up at Emily. "No, it's not just about support. There's something I need him to know, something I need him to have. I've kept too many things hidden, and I can't leave this world with more secrets weighing me down." She paused, her voice trembling. "There's a box, an old wooden box, hidden in my home. It has letters, photos, pieces of the life I wanted Daniel to know about, but never had the courage to share. I need him to see it, to understand where he came from." Emily nodded, her heart aching for the old woman's final request. She knew that Ruth's secrets had cost her deeply, and now, in her last days, Ruth was desperately trying to mend the broken pieces of her life, hoping that her son could find peace in the past she had once tried to bury. That evening, Emily met Daniel in the hospital's quiet waiting area, pulling him aside to share Ruth's request. Daniel listened, his face a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He looked down, his jaw clenched, as he took in the gravity of her words. "She has a box," he murmured, almost to himself. "I had no idea." Emily nodded. "She told me it contains letters, memories, things she wanted to share but couldn't. I think this is her way of giving you a piece of herself that she was too afraid to show before." Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes distant as he considered what his mother's hidden past might reveal. He had spent years believing he understood her, that he had come to terms with her absence. But now, faced with the reality that she had kept so much of herself locked away, he felt a surge of mixed emotions: anger, sadness, and a deep, aching curiosity. That night, after leaving the hospital, Daniel made his way to Ruth's modest home, a small cottage on the outskirts of town that had stood untouched by visitors for years. The cottage was quaint and unassuming, with chipped paint and a slightly overgrown garden, but it held the stories of a lifetime, memories that were now his to uncover. With a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell of old wood and lavender lingering in the air. The interior was simple, filled with worn furniture and a few scattered personal items. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, a world preserved in silence. Daniel wandered through the small rooms, his fingers trailing over the surfaces of tables and chairs that had been his mother's companions in his absence. He could feel her presence here, in the quiet corners, and faded photos lining the walls. each one telling a story he'd never been part of. After a few minutes, he found the box tucked away in a small closet, hidden beneath a stack of old quilts. It was an unremarkable wooden box, worn and scuffed, its edges softened by time. Daniel hesitated, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him, but then he lifted the lid, his breath catching as he saw the contents within. Inside, he found letters written in his mother's delicate handwriting, each one addressed to him, but never sent. The ink was faded, the paper fragile, but the words carried an intimacy and honesty that brought tears to his eyes. Each letter was a glimpse into her thoughts and fears, her hopes for him, her regrets, and the love she had never stopped feeling. She had written to him during his milestones, his first day of school, his graduation, even his birthdays that had passed in silence. Every letter was a testament to a mother's enduring love, a love that had persisted despite the distance, the silence, and the pain. Alongside the letters were photos he'd never seen before, images of Ruth as a young woman, holding him as a baby, smiling in a way he could barely remember. There were photos of her with his father, too, candid moments filled with laughter and warmth, capturing a side of his mother that had been hidden from him all his life. And as he looked at these snapshots of a life he had never known, he felt a deep sadness for all the moments they had missed, all the years lost to misunderstandings and unspoken words. But amidst the sorrow, he also felt a sense of healing. For the first time, he could see his mother as a whole person, not just the woman who had left him, but a complex individual with her own struggles, dreams, and sacrifices. He realized that she had carried her own burdens, that her decision to stay away had been shaped by fears he hadn't fully understood until now. And in that moment, he forgave her, not only for leaving, but for all the choices she had made in her attempt to protect him, even if those choices had cost them both so much. As he closed the box and prepared to leave, Daniel felt a strange peace settle over him. He had found what he hadn't realized he was looking for: closure. His mother's life, her secrets, her pain. They were now part of his story, but they no longer held the power to hurt him. Instead, they had become a source of strength, a reminder of the resilience and love that had shaped them both. The next day, Daniel returned to the hospital, the box in hand, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Ruth was resting when he entered her room, but she stirred when she heard his footsteps, her eyes lighting up when she saw him holding the box. A faint smile crossed her lips, and she reached out a trembling hand. You found it," she whispered, her voice filled with both relief and apprehension. Daniel nodded, setting the box on her bedside table. "I did, Mom. I read the letters, looked through the photos. I understand now. I finally understand why you did what you did." A tear slid down Ruth's cheek, her frail hand reaching for his. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "I should have told you. I should have been there for you." Daniel squeezed her hand, his own eyes filled with tears. "I know, Mom, but I forgive you. I forgive you for everything. I just wish we had found our way back to each other sooner." They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but the air between them was filled with an unspoken peace, a sense of closure that had eluded them for so long. Emily, who had quietly entered the room, watched the scene from the doorway, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. She knew that this was the moment Ruth and Daniel had needed, the healing that had finally bridged the gap between them. In the days that followed, Ruth's health continued to decline, but Daniel was there by her side, holding her hand, sharing stories, and cherishing every moment. He knew that her time was drawing near, but he also knew that they had finally found the peace they had both been searching for. And when Ruth finally passed, her face was serene, her hand still clasped in Daniel's, their journey together finally complete. The impact of Ruth and Daniel's story rippled through the small town, touching everyone who had known them. Emily, inspired by the experience, shared the story with her colleagues and friends, not as a tale of loss, but as one of love, redemption, and the power of second chances. Ruth's legacy became a quiet reminder that it was never too late to seek forgiveness, to heal old wounds, and to reconnect with the people we love. For Daniel, his mother's final gift, the letters, the memories, and the truth she had finally shared, became a source of strength that he carried with him. He found himself returning to the cottage, not as a place of sorrow, but as a home filled with his mother's spirit, a place where he could feel close to her, even after she was gone. And in those quiet moments, he understood that while their time together had been brief, it had been enough. After Ruth's passing, Daniel found himself transformed in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her death left a hollow space within him, but it was softened by the peace they'd found together in her final days. The letters she had written, and the memories they'd shared, had given him something he'd spent years searching for, a sense of belonging, a bridge back to a past he had abandoned out of anger and hurt. And now, for the first time, he felt whole, even in his grief. Daniel continued to live in Ruth's cottage, which had become a place of solace and reflection. Each room seemed to carry echoes of his mother's presence, as if she lingered there, watching over him. The box of letters sat on a small table by his bed, its contents now worn from the many times he'd read through each page, absorbing her words, finding new layers of meaning every time he revisited them. He would often sit on the worn sofa by the window, holding a letter in his hand, and feel as if she were speaking to him, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. News of Ruth's passing spread through the town, touching the lives of those who had known her as the quiet woman who had once lived on the edge of their small community. She hadn't been one to socialize much, yet her story of love, regret, and reconciliation had become a kind of legend among the townspeople. It resonated with people in unexpected ways, stirring memories of their own family ties and past grievances. Friends and neighbors, some who barely knew her, visited Daniel, bringing flowers, food, and shared memories of Ruth. They would linger, asking about her last days, listening with rapt attention as Daniel shared parts of their story, now a narrative of both heartbreak and healing. Emily, the nurse who had facilitated their reunion, became a close friend to Daniel in the weeks following Ruth's death. They'd met often, usually at the hospital where Emily worked, or at a small cafe where they would talk over coffee, sharing stories and reflections. Emily was moved by the changes she saw in Daniel. He was no longer the guarded, hardened man she had met at his cabin, but someone softened by the experience of reconciliation, of allowing himself to open his heart again. One evening, as they sat in the cafe, Emily looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, you've become a different person since you reconnected with your mom," she observed, a gentle smile on her face. Daniel nodded, a wistful look in his eyes. "I guess I have. She taught me something I hadn't expected. I spent so many years building walls, thinking that anger and resentment would protect me from pain. But those walls only made me lonelier. It wasn't until I forgave her, and myself, that I realized how much I'd been missing." Emily reached out, placing a comforting hand on his. "That's the gift she left you, Daniel. Sometimes the people we love the most can only reach us after they're gone. It's strange, but I think Ruth knew you'd find peace this way, through understanding her life and her choices." The conversations with Emily brought Daniel a sense of clarity. He realized he wanted to do something meaningful with the lessons he'd learned, to honor his mother's memory in a way that extended beyond his own healing. With Emily's encouragement, he began working on an art series inspired by Ruth's life. Each piece was a reflection of the complex emotions he had felt throughout their journey together: anger, sorrow, forgiveness, and love. The canvases captured both the light and darkness of their relationship, the fractures and the healing, a testament to the enduring bond between mother and son. As he painted, Daniel felt as though he was still communicating with Ruth, still unraveling the depths of their connection. The project became a way to process his grief, to transform his pain into something beautiful and lasting. His home became a studio, filled with canvases that held fragments of their story. Neighbors would stop by, curious about his work, and he would invite them in, sharing parts of his journey with them. Many of them were moved by the story, finding pieces of their own lives mirrored in the art, in the expressions of love and regret that Daniel had poured onto the canvas. Eventually, word of his project reached a local gallery owner who was captivated by both the art and the story behind it. The owner invited Daniel to display his series in a small exhibition, and though the thought of sharing such personal pieces with the public initially filled him with hesitation, Daniel accepted, knowing this was part of the journey Ruth had set him on. The exhibition was titled Letters to the Past, each piece accompanied by a short excerpt from the letters Ruth had left behind, offering viewers a glimpse into her life, her regrets, and her love for her son. The night of the exhibition was surreal. People from all over town and beyond came to see the artwork, each piece resonating with viewers in profound ways. Emily stood by Daniel's side, offering her quiet support as he shared his mother's story, and the story of their reconciliation with strangers who had been drawn to the exhibit. Some visitors openly wept, moved by the raw honesty of his work, the vulnerability of a man who had found healing in the most unlikely of places. One woman approached Daniel with tears in her eyes, clutching her daughter's hand. "Thank you for sharing this," she said, her voice choked with emotion. I haven't spoken to my own mother in years. I've been too stubborn to reach out, but your story makes me want to try." Daniel nodded, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. "Sometimes it's not about what we've been through, but what we choose to do with it," he replied. "My mother taught me that, and I'm finally learning to let go of the things that held me back, to open myself to the possibility of forgiveness." As the exhibition drew to a close, Daniel felt a profound sense of closure. His mother's legacy had touched lives, even those who had never met her, and he knew that her story would live on in the hearts of those who had been moved by her journey. Ruth, in her own quiet way, had managed to bring about healing, not just for her son, but for an entire community. In the months that followed, Daniel's life took on a new rhythm, one marked by gratitude and purpose. He continued to paint, inspired by the memories of his mother and the lessons she had imparted. He began volunteering at the local community center, teaching art to children and young adults, many of whom came from difficult backgrounds. He found solace in sharing his story with them, using his own experiences to encourage them to face their own pain, to find strength in their vulnerabilities. One day, as he was setting up for an art class, a young girl approached him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Mr. Daniel," she asked, her voice soft, "why do you paint sad things and happy things at the same time?" Daniel smiled, crouching down to her level. "Because life is like that," he said gently. "Sometimes the sad things and the happy things are mixed together, and we have to find a way to understand both. My mother taught me that. She showed me that even in the hardest moments, there's a reason to keep going, to find beauty in everything." The girl nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting to a painting of Ruth that hung on the wall, one of Daniel's favorite pieces, a portrait of her, eyes filled with both sorrow and strength, her spirit captured in every brushstroke. The girl seemed to sense the depth of the painting, as if somehow, even at her young age, she could understand the layers of love and loss within it. Daniel watched her walk away, a deep sense of peace settling over him. His mother's memory lived on, not only through the art, but through the lives he touched, the people he helped, the stories he shared. She had given him the greatest gift, a journey back to himself, a path toward forgiveness, and a legacy of love that transcended time and loss. As the years passed, Daniel continued to honor his mother's memory, not with grand gestures but through small, meaningful acts of kindness and connection. Ruth's story became part of the town's fabric, a tale told and retold, a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the beauty of reconciliation. And though he still missed her, he felt her presence in every brushstroke, every lesson, every moment he shared with others. Ruth's journey had led him to this life, and he was finally at peace, knowing he had fulfilled her final wish, to live with an open heart, unburdened by the past, guided by the love that had always bound them together.